really nice pleasure to be back here. I did my PhD here in Interacting Minds, so I was very lucky to receive some very good training. I have to say it's a little bit of a funny topic for me because I don't know if you know these American commercials that are sort of like, somebody's sick in the airplane and say we need a doctor, and the guy comes up and starts doing the operation, and then they say, oh, you're a doctor? He said, no, I just stayed in a Holiday Inn last night. Anyway, so it's kind of like that with mind wandering. So I'm not really an expert on mind wandering. I don't really actively research it or work on it, but I do a lot of mind wandering. And I've also published a few papers in the past with Jonathan, and my work really globally focuses on self-awareness and consciousness and metacognition. And in general at UCL, I'm pursuing a project of trying to see if we can build kind of computational and connectomic models of these types of higher order processes. And I think in that domain, having an understanding of something that you've heard many times is very global, is very integrative, is actually very relevant for my project. So unfortunately, I don't have any kind of nice data to show you, so you can turn off the parts of your brain that interrogate data. I don't really know how this talk will go because it's sort of cribbed from my usual Bayesian metacognition talk and wrapped up with a bunch of stuff that Johnny's always telling me about. But I think we'll see how it goes. That's all I can tell you. So I'm going to talk about loosely 3 things. We'll kind of do some pedagogical talking about methods and phenomenology. I was told that would be very good, so I'll try to start with a very basic pace. We'll do a little experiment. We'll try to get a feeling for what it's actually like to study mind wandering or the default mode. We'll talk about architecture, which is a big part of my focus. You'll see this guy here again and again. I like to just hide him in the corners of the slide wherever I can. At some point we'll actually talk about what this is and what connectomics means and what it brings to the table of understanding the default mode. And then I may not get that far. I may try to stop halfway through, but if it's not really bad halfway through, I will sketch a kind of Bayesian model of mind wandering that Johnny and I have been thinking about. But that's dangerously speculative. So I like to sometimes, being a Bayesian, I like to start a talk by right out in front telling you what I actually think something is. So I'll tell you my hypothesis, and then at the end we can see if we should update our beliefs about it. So I believe that the default mode network is increasingly a kind of what I call a meta network, or a metastable network, if you're familiar with sort of the Gustavo Deco approach to the brain. I don't really think that the default mode network is a thing. I think it's kind of a catch-all term, and that essentially what we're seeing is a kind of the baseline of what you get when you're at the intersection of everything that it is to do information processing as a human being. So what we'll talk about in a second is some of the functions that are involved in or associated with the network, and I think I will hopefully try to pull out why there's this common thread in terms of what it actually do. From a sort of Bayesian jargony way, part of the model I've been working on with Carl Friston is the idea of how do you understand the brain when you start to move beyond simple kind of visual recognition, auditory recognition, into a hierarchy where you have levels that are not actually concerned with any one modality, but are actually making global predictions about the kind of conjoint probability of stuff in the environment and also in the internal milieu. And I think that we can map some of that onto the model of what the default mode does. And hopefully what I'd like to explain is I think something that unfortunately Johnny is actually not that interested in anymore, which is perceptual decoupling. One of the things that's really interesting to me from Johnny's model from the 2014 paper, I think, is the idea that it's been replicated many, many times that when people report they have a high state of mind wandering, or when you sort of triangulate whether they're mind wandering using or various physiological measures, you see this global attenuation of sensory information. You see a marked reduction in sensory ERPs. You see lower hit rates, and not only because of distractibility, but because of a sort of actual boost in the signal, a reduction in the signal-noise ratio of sensory cortex. I think that's a really interesting thing, particularly if you're into the kind of Bayesian brain, because one of the things you really look at with this stuff is, why should the brain do this? Why should the brain ever turn off its sensory environment if what it wants is to build an accurate model of it? And ultimately I'll try to argue that it actually has to do this to arrive at the best model. So I have a lot of text. Oh, so this is trying to be pedagogical. So I like to do the kind of quiz of what is the default mode. Okay, so is the default mode 1, a useful turn of phrase to describe higher than normal metabolic activity between tasks? Is it what people do when they're bored? Is it the Godhead from which consciousness is born? Or is it just a basic structural temporal facet of the brain? I lean towards 4, but I can tell you some of my colleagues in the domain I fled from, meditation studies, really like number 3, I think. But we don't want to be that grandiose. A few kind of points to consider that we've been talking about throughout the whole thing is how to actually measure this system. Is it all observational? Do we just ask someone how they're feeling? Do we perturb the system somehow? Do we have to give up any type of experimental control? Or is there some range of methods we can use to actually get at it? And I think the rest of these are just variations on those. One that's really come out of Daniel's project in London at the Hubbub. I don't know how much you guys know about that, but it's this quite interesting interdisciplinary project to bring together sociologists and neuroscientists and philosophers to think about what is rest. And I think that's still a question, phenomenologically speaking, that doesn't get asked enough. You can really think about, so who here's been in a scanner before? Show of hands. Okay, almost everybody's been in a scanner, right? And it's a pretty weird experience, isn't it? You're sort of like cut off from the world. You can't take any action. You have to kind of listen to this odd kind of bad techno music. It's a really bizarre experience that we put people through, and I think we have to kind of be critical about making inferences that maybe overload this state, which is quite ambiguous. So I think this is already reviewed, but a lot of the questions I'm interested in kind of answering in this domain is, first of all, like I said, why did the brain decouple? Why should we stop attending to or processing sensory information in favor of internal stuff? It seems like kind of a silly idea. I mean, for the brain, not theoretically. What's the use of the kind of stochasticity that's characterized by the default mode? So some people think of these oscillations as a kind of intrinsic rise of noise in the brain. And if you're of the Firstonian perspective, you probably think that the brain is trying to minimize its noise, it's trying to minimize its error, and somehow get around the intrinsic noise that's influenced by the body and by the environment. So it would seem like a weird thing to have a core process of the brain be to just spontaneously fluctuate up and down. I think we'd like to solve that if we can. And then, of course, more generally for me, in my research program of meta-awareness, or awareness and metacognition, just what are the functions of this specific domain of internally generated stuff? So, to try to think about the default mode, I think it's nice, as you've seen through all of our talks, to sort of zoom back out in our perspective and think about what is the brain, which is where the default mode is located. So, somewhere in there. It would have been great if this could have had like some hidden figures in it or something like that. But so cognitive neuroscience starts right with this kind of Van Essen perspective, where you have a logic of subtraction, a logic of pure insertion that lets us make subtractions of pure conditions to localize function. I can show you some gratings that tilt with a certain orientation to the left or right. I can identify the specific bit of your brain that shows sensitivity to left or right tilted gratings. I can do this in many different ways. I can open up monkeys, and I can eventually build a map like this, which has been around for at least 30 years now, I think, which is the classic Van Essen, I think, from cat tracing studies, diagram of the visual hierarchy. And this is something that's been hugely powerful, this type of approach, because once we understood that the visual system was arranged in this way, where there was sort of both functional localization and functional integration, we could really have some success in starting to pull it apart. I mean, arguably vision neuroscience is one of the most advanced, most established that there is. So ultimately we'd like to have something like a hierarchy if we can understand the way the brain is actually processing information. Oh, okay, so I don't know if that was... So, and I guess one of the tensions with understanding the default mode is, at the same time we're trying to get away from an overly restrictive approach to actually understand the stuff we can't get at with this simple reductionistic approach. So at this point I just figured I should put a reference to the only study I ever published on mind wandering, because everybody else had cool data, and I wanted to show that I also had some some data, and it's more pedagogical, I think, than my random theory about what it all is. So this is kind of a funny story. This was a study that I got funding from the Mind and Life Foundation to do a mind-wandering study on Danish people with many thousand hours of meditation experience, to try to see if they were better or worse at go, no-go inhibition and error monitoring, and whether there'd be any difference in their mind wandering, because like I've mentioned before, the meditation community is sort of obsessed with getting rid of mind wandering because it's a bad thing. And the funny thing is, we actually found that there was a 10% difference between the groups in their stop accuracy. They were much better at stopping on average, but they were no better whatsoever at their error monitoring. They had no difference in their mind wandering scores whatsoever. So probably to the chagrin of the Mind and Life organization, I partnered with Johnny, and we just basically pooled all the data from the two groups and answered some more basic questions about mind wandering. So there's just a footnote in this paper that says, additionally, one group had 10% higher stop accuracy. We do control analysis to remove the group effect from everything, but it's sort of like the meditation study that wasn't. And what we do here, so this is just a classic go, no-go task, and I show this because it's an example of how you can totally ask questions about the default mode without having to do something unconstrained. This is a classic response inhibition task. You can even fit some kind of model. If you're familiar with stop signal literature, you can model the probability of a stop signal. It's a very powerful paradigm. We took this from Rob Hester, who has used it quite a lot to study the difference between aware errors and unaware errors, which you simply operationalize. So you see it's a kind of Stroop task, where you have blue and green, blue and red. So this is there are two rules when you should not press the button. One is when the word is repeated, so here you should withhold your response, and here is another repeat, and then the second rule is when you actually have the kind of Stroop consistent red colored red. And you're supposed to withhold in both of these, and the idea is that because you have the competing rules, you sometimes forget them and you make errors, and some portion of these errors you're not conscious of, which people actually report. So this is showing this here. This is somewhere where I've just pressed the button and I never noticed I made an error, at least I never reported it. And this is a case where I press the wrong button, and on the next trial I press a fix button to let the experimenter know I did something wrong. So it's a very basic kind of error monitoring metacognition task. And then very Smallwood style, we put in some, or old school Smallwood style I should say, maybe more Christoph style. We put in some thought probes, which were actually asking, can't really read this here, but where was your attention just before the probe, very off task, very on task, and then this was something my old supervisor Anton Lutz wanted, which was how sticky your thoughts were before the probe. He felt this was something very important for meditation. I still don't know why, but and then we had to do all kinds of control analysis to show that this sticky thing wasn't a constant problem. So what we looked at here was something. For a long time, I'd had the feeling that the way people were studying mind wandering was kind of naive, because you have these probes that come up and you ask people, were you on task, were you off task, what were you thinking about? And if you look at something like the metacognition literature, where we use signal detection theoretic methods to actually quantify the accuracy of someone's subjective report, and we see that people vary massively in their ability to actually make these reports accurately. For me, there's two ways to use phenomenological data. One is in terms of the content of what people tend to say, and the other is really in the kind of structure or variability in the way they use those ratings. And that's kind of almost more interesting than what they actually tell you, because presumably they're not aware of the way they use the scale. I mean, that's an empirical hypothesis, but I would assume compared to the conscious sort of weird decision you make on every trial about what your mind was doing, the variance of the scale over trials, which is kind of, you could think of it like your titration, you could think of it as your sensitivity to your own states. It's a bit ambiguous. We ideally could have done some follow-up work, but one way or another, it says something about the actual fluctuations of your mental state, and it's presumably not something the subject's actually aware of. So the idea was to see whether we could identify aspects of the TUT mean. So this is the mean that they report on across all trials of, I was mind wandering a lot, I wasn't mind wandering very much, and compare it to the standard deviation across trials, and then to see how these things would differentially predict the two main outcome variables from the error awareness task, which are your stop accuracy and your actual error awareness score. So what we did was we built multiple regression models, sort of residualizing everything for the alternative variables, because of course there are some correlations between mean and variance. It's not actually as high as you would think. We made sure to look for, not too high multicollinearity and things. And essentially what we were able to do was show that this is kind of replication of the standard effect in the literature. So when people say they're mind wandering a lot, it's been a while. I've never presented these data before, so let's see. So the stop accuracy higher is better. Tut mean is, so stopping more, that was mind wandering less. Exactly. So when people say they're mind wandering a lot, this is an individual differences level, they actually were making much more stop errors. And there was no relationship between tut variance and their stop accuracy. So the amount of mean, or the amount of standard deviation in your self-reported mind wandering didn't predict your actual accuracy. But there was a relationship between the variance of the report and the error monitoring. So there's a kind of double association. It seems essentially that the content of your report does accurately reflect the fact that you were mind wandering a lot, but the way you use that scale somehow relates to your actual ability to accurately monitor your own errors. And we interpreted this as kind of evidence that mind wandering is something that's very important for balancing between the internal and external demands of cognition. The idea being that if you imagine someone who's just always saying, yeah, I'm really mind wandering a lot, or I'm really not mind wandering, versus someone who's a little more flexible in the way they make their report, where they're actually constantly updating their idea about how much they're mind wandering. One person, even if he's accurate about the fact that he's not mind wandering, may be kind of overly engaged in one mode and not actually able to monitor. Sorry, an easy way to explain it is basically just like self-monitoring probably involves information both about your external performance and your internal performance. So if you're someone who's frequently going back and forth between mind wandering and task processing, it should make sense that you have better self-monitoring. And we looked at some of the brain signals, and we just found that this is basically a replication of what you should see in error awareness tasks. So this is the positive effect of stop accuracy on trials where you correctly stop, and you see kind of motor cortex, salience network, and basal ganglia, putamen, which are classical inhibition areas. And then we looked at the correlation of the TUT reports over trials versus but in comparison to the deactivation on stop trials, just because it was kind of interesting to probe the question of, is mind wandering really something bad for you that relates just solely to executive inhibition, or is there kind of two systems where one is more associated with the central executive aspects of the default mode, and another is more associated with the self-aware, self-monitoring kind of stuff? And we found a pretty nice spatial dissociation, which I think really closely maps some of the data you've seen from Johnny and Daniel and everyone. So, yeah. Okay, so that's it for that part. I told you this would be a disjointed talk, and it is. Okay, so that's one way you can study mind wandering, right? You can actually do a classical experiment, you can use subjective probes, or you can just stick somebody in a scanner and measure the brain while they do nothing. So I think it's always kind of funny to try to actually experience what this is like. So what I've done is I've just made a very short demonstration of an experiment that we can do together. So what's going to happen is there's going to be, Davis, give me that look. There's going to be, like I do in my perception experiment, there's going to be a flash of a Gabor patch. And the Gabor patch is either going to be not tilted, it'll be horizontal, or it'll be 45 degrees tilted. And I want you to just tap with your finger, or you can count with your mind, every time the patch is tilted. Okay? We can try this. I have no idea if this will work. Ready? Go. Don't move. wasn't that painful. So, what did people think about while the Gabber Patch wasn't playing? Does anybody, I want to, somebody tell me, we'll go around. Who thought of anything other than the Gabber Patch? I saw you think about something, and you thought about something as well. What did you guys think about? Did you think about why I was doing this silly thing?
Yeah, trying to predict where you're going with this.
So I'll take that as an example
And whether
of...
or not there was any error in the slide.
Oh, was there some error in the slide?
Yeah, so I was thinking
So
about
this is
task and where you were going with this.
Okay, so we'll take the first one as example of social stuff and prospection stuff. I was hoping everybody would say what they thought about it. Did anybody think what they were going to have for dinner later? So you guys are really good subjects. Anyway, I'm just trying to waste time, basically. No. I'm kidding. So, I don't know. I think there's a few things, right? So one thing is that when you focus on the Gabber Patch, you kind of feel your perception shrinking, right? You kind of, you're focusing on this, you're not thinking about what you have to do later, you're not thinking about the email you have to make, hopefully. But there's this kind of, in the background, there's still something going on there, right? I mean, it's not like your brain has shut off. It's not like the thing that is you, the thinking organism, has somehow gone away. It's still there, and presumably the only reason you did this at all was because, like, you don't want to be really rude, you don't want to, like, hurt my feelings or anything like that, right? So the bit of you that is that higher order socially thing was still in the driver's seat. Oh, it's going to do it again. It's really hard to get a looping thing in Photoshop. You basically have to repeat it. So I think that served its pedagogical point. And then you can ask, okay, so what did all this reveal? I'm just going to blow through this because you guys have seen all of this. These are the famous Rakel images from the meta-analysis of what happens in that little bit when you were seeing the crosshair versus the bit. So you really think that this is just the times when you saw the crosshair versus the time when you saw the Gabber Patch, right, over many, many trials. And this is something that is very easy to replicate. I actually know some labs that say the one thing they know they can count on for sure is if the subject falls asleep, they'll see it because the default mode will be on. So, and as we've heard, it revealed, I mean, the default mode didn't per se, but in parallel, we've had the emergence of kind of functional connectivity studies, which I think it's always nice, like I said earlier, to point out that these were originally having nothing to do with these kind of higher order funky things, but being completely concerned with just like, I mean, Biswal was literally concerned with, is there a basic transfer function for how information gets from left to right motor cortex? And he was very surprised when it was just a simple Pearson correlation, essentially. To more fancy things like anti-correlation and the idea that there's a task positive network and a task negative network, and they oscillate on and off, and the brain is now not just a blobological picture, but is actually some kind of dynamic entity. All methodological caveats aside, towards what we see emerging now, or actually over the past 10 years, is an increasingly kind of data-driven connectomic approach. So these are the EO networks that you've heard a lot about, and I've been quite inspired by listening to some of Johnny and Daniel's ideas. So I don't think you guys told the story of, I don't know if Daniel told the story of where some of the distance, did you tell the whole thing about how you were looking at it and then you just saw the pattern of red? So the story I've heard is that Johnny and Daniel...
I thought it was crazy. Apparently.
Yeah.
Found out, so.
Did you tell this story?
No, I showed the thing.
So the story I heard, which I really liked, was that they were just hanging out at Johnny's house, and they had these just up on the wall, as you do, when you're having friends over. And they were just kind of looking at it, and Daniel sort of had this epiphany that there's some kind of, because most people when they look at this, and I hope this is...
No, this is absolutely true.
Absolutely true.
Absolutely true.
So, when I first looked at this, I thought, this is just a mosaic. This could be like a Jackson Pollock painting or something, right? It's just totally random. There's no structure to it. And Daniel had this kind of insight that if we look at each kind of major outflow node around here, there's always this kind of red, I always get the direction wrong, but it's like red, yellow, pink. Red, yellow, pink. Where'd it go? Up here you can see it, like red, yellow, pink. So you're thinking, okay, what the hell's the point of this? Actually, the point of it was shown very well by his distance talk, because the really interesting thing is that there's a preservation of local pattern. I think once you actually look for it, you can really clearly see it. At each of the major outflow networks, or outflow nodes of the default mode, you have this kind of repeating mosaic pattern. So the idea started to come about that maybe we can reduce the complexity of this problem further and actually start to think of a kind of hierarchy of regions. So I think the distance idea captures this very nicely, because you've got basically areas that are at the periphery, like Daniel told us, that are input-output. They're far away from whatever it is the default mode network does, and they're associated with the things that lets the organism actually interact with the world. Then you've got the default mode itself, which we know is associated with theory of mind and social cognition, autobiographical memory, reward prediction error, like any type of value, belief, maybe belief, desire, psychology, if you like, any type of thing where you need to make abstract inferences that have almost nothing to do with current sensory information, and then always some kind of, like the orange bit, which is always in some kind of highly heteromodal, associative, or limbic area. And it's like a sandwich. It's like, why would you have this sort of deep belief network embedded in there, which doesn't care about the environment, and then this very, basic input-output network? Why do you even need this internal sandwich region? And one of the ways that we started to understand this problem is through connectomics. So basically what you do in a kind of Sporensian style experiment is you take a resting state scan, you use some parcellation scheme. It could be completely data driven, so you could automatically find the best clustering solution to pull apart as many different components from all the voxels. So this is, I think, the 8 network solution. There's also like a 12 network solution. And then you basically just put them in a giant matrix, right? So you have a big matrix where the identity line is self connecting to self, and every other row and connection is like, node 1 connected to node 2, and so on. And then once you have this matrix of just essentially Pearson's correlations going all the way through, you can start to apply methods that are sort of illustrated here, derived from network theory, graph theory, whatever type of computational network theory you like. And you get something that is called the connectome, but I think is much better referred to as a hairball. So the reason I call it a hairball is there was a really nice data science blog post a few months ago by this guy who was saying, everywhere in data science right now, these hairball figures is just like a nasty tangle of stuff, right? So people in UCL hate these kind of figures because they just look messy. They just seem like a really complicated description that on first pass doesn't really seem to tell you anything. It's just a tangled, and like if we look at the next page, this is really like a hairball, right? Like a cat could have coughed this up. But one of the things that Olaf has really contributed is, based on the measures you use, you can actually find some global structure in this hairball, which is reproducible now many, many times. It exists across many different structures, and it's this idea of a kind of rich club network, which follows a small world organization. So you can see that if you actually know what you're looking for here. So if you see around the periphery, there are lots and lots of local connections, right? The predominant number of connections you see here are local, just this nearby region connecting to this nearby region, right? And then something like maybe 20% of the connections in the whole brain are these long-range connections, which are, connecting one entire cortical patch to another cortical patch. And if we go back to here, this is kind of reciprocating this idea that we've got little highly connected sub-communities of brain areas that are then flowing through some kind of big pipe system to come out to another similar little local community. And Olaf has now started to show again and again that the default mode network is, if you measure its node centrality, which is kind of like the ratio of incoming to outcoming connections, you see that these areas, not only the default mode, but also some of the salience network areas like the interior insula and cingulate, they form this rich club, which are basically, you can think of them as they're connecting to everything in the brain. They're having low local connectivity and just completely dominated by long-range connectivity all over the brain. And the idea is that they're sort of super integrative hubs that are necessary to have some kind of high-level integrative computation. Because the little local stuff, all this guy, we know from the Van Essen diagram that these are great for doing feed-forward recognition of low-level, is the line tilted left or is it right? But when you have to then translate that into some kind of supramodal information format that the organism can use to plan its future or do a shopping list or whatever, where sensory information is not that relevant, then you need some kind of structure like this to be able to represent that. So, okay, we're okay on time. So, I think this is a common theme for me to try to understand what the system is doing, is this notion of integration. So we're trying to move from kind of hairball to hierarchy, but without necessarily losing the intrinsic thing that makes the system what it is, right? So this type of hierarchy won't do it, because as you've been hearing all day, you probably can't decompose the network into little sub-modules. It might just not exist. It might be that what the network is literally an on-the-fly combination of lots of little other sub-modules. So we need to think about the problem a little more carefully. And one of the things I think that's really useful is to start to think in the time domain. So this is just a nice pedagogical graph of the Fourier transform. And I only show it because it's a kind of nice illustration of how a very large scale, very slow kind of waveform can have embedded with it many faster waveforms, right? This is just basic signal processing theory, that any oscillatory activity can be composed of many different frequencies, and we can use something like the Fourier transform to actually break those apart and see what the composite frequencies are that make up the big wave. And the reason why this is relevant for understanding the default modes, this is something that actually Reiko likes to talk about a lot, but it comes from a Finnish group who do what they call infraslow EEG, I think also infraslow MEG. And essentially, they do this experiment, which I thought was very nice, where they have people doing a very simple kind of, I think it's like a stop signal task, where you're making many button presses, just kind of boring, low demand over a long period of time. And they run this for hours. And what they do is they do a kind of bending strategy. They make temporal bends of the actual behavioral performance so that you can see kind of slow buildups in the likelihood to make a miss, to make an error. And they actually see, so it's kind of hard to pull it out here, but basically they see that there are in fact very slow, like on the order of a 100-second oscillation, behavioral oscillations where people become more or less likely overall to make commission errors, and that in the EEG bands, these are correlated with this kind of what they call the infraslow rhythm, which is like on that same time scale of one oscillation every 100 seconds. And they show that not only does this predict the likelihood to make these errors on the bigger cycle, but it also predicts coherence between all the faster frequency bands. And the idea is that, if we move out from the spatial perspective, this temporal integration is because basically what we're seeing with the resting state of the brain is the kind of rise and fall of a kind of global integration signal, which is taking all those little sensory representations that are stored away in their local communities and building them up into some kind of common theme that can then be used to actually manipulate and act on sensory information. And we can see this also in work by Yuri Hassan, where here what he's done is he's taken a kind of narrative story, the Little Red Riding Hood, and he's scrambled it up in different time bends. So he's either scrambled it at the word level or the sentence level or at whole paragraphs. And then he's used a kind of multivariate technique to see what are the areas that show sensitivity or are the most encoding of this kind of level of temporal hierarchy. And he finds, of course, through the auditory cortex that there's a kind of almost like a very nice like sensory feed-forward type of hierarchy from low-level areas which are really disrupted by just the change in the sounds of the story, to higher areas. And then we see that the default mode network areas are clearly mostly sensitive to the disruption at the level of paragraphs and sentences. I couldn't find it, but actually there are also meta-analytic studies that you might have actually done showing that if you try to map the functional heterogeneity across the cortex, so if you do a big meta-analysis and you try to ask something like how specific is a brain region activation for a certain task, and you back project this on the cortex, you'll see again as you go sort of back to front that lower sensory motor areas tend to be pretty specific. They tend to be have a highly specific functional profile, whereas the farther along you get to that frontal pole, the more heterogeneous it is, the more unspecific the activation is for any one type of task. If we zoom out even further on a developmental perspective, this is all, you see the same type of integrative thing. So these are famous videos from the Gogte et al. Development study where they tracked gray matter development from, I think, age 5 to age 20. And what you see as it goes from hot to cool is gray matter atrophy, which is a marker of maturation. And unfortunately, there are 4 supplementary videos. Not one of them has the medial slice, which is annoying. But you can kind of see, if you watch the heat receding in there, you can see that the very last places to develop as we reach adolescence and adulthood are these default mode areas, which are basically incredibly important for all the things we think of as being particular to a person. So all the social, self, dynamic type of stuff you have to learn through your life, where the stimulus or the response don't matter that much, but what really matters is how you put it all together in some kind of bigger picture. And there's even a recent study that was published in Nature Neuroscience that I just blogged about, where they basically took human connectome data and they asked, how well can we decode the person's identity from their connectivity graph, just from one of these, Pearson correlation matrices. And they found that they could do it exceedingly well, so they could do anywhere from 95 to 100% accuracy. Importantly, they could also sort of decompose this multivariate procedure so they could back project onto the networks to see which combinations of networks were driving the classification accuracy. So you can think of this like, the whole idea is that if there's something that makes me unique, it's my particular connectome pattern, well then maybe some areas contribute that more. So like we've just said, probably my visual cortex, probably it's really hard to identify me from my visual cortex if we all have really similar ones. And that's exactly what they found. So they found that the 2 networks, I don't have basically each one of these numbers is a whole network, but they found this is a measure of the sort of contribution to the decoding in terms of similarity, and this is a measure in terms of, dissimilarity versus similarity. And these networks up here that were doing the major contribution were essentially the central executive and default mode networks, whereas the areas that were the least contributing were primary sensory areas. So it's even important at the level of integrating who you are as an individual. Okay, I don't know, I think I might skip the model part. So to bring it all together, we can say that the default mode reflects the nature of a temporally multiplexed, functionally integrative, potentially socially conscious kind of system. I really even think we can go beyond to say it's not really a system, it's just what human brains do, maybe even some lower mammalian brains. It's what happens when you get a massively complex system that has to integrate information across multiple different domains, particularly when you have a competition between the kind of stuff we store in memory and the kind of very high-speed demands of decoding a complex environment. And then when it really gets tricky, I think, is not necessarily doing either or of those in a separate domain, but the problem of how do I take a very subtle sensory cue, like I'm in an interview and my boss is giving me a kind of funny eye, and somehow I know to shift my whole strategy in the interview, and I do this very seamlessly, this kind of thing where it's very dynamic and perceptually demanding, but also requires a very fast usage of complex, abstract information. What? Like I said, this is totally speculative. Yeah, I don't know. I'm trying to decide if I want to do the sketch of yes, do it. Okay. So, because I work with Carl Friston and we are obsessed with the Bayesian brain hypothesis, more realistically, a lot of my work is trying to fit a kind of predictive coding model to the type of metacognition Johnny was talking about earlier. So I ask questions like, how does sensory mean invariance influence people's metacognitive accuracy? And how do we construct subjective confidence given different multisensory cues? I thought, maybe I could take some of this information that I have about what we think the brain does in that group and try to understand some of Johnny's ideas about perceptual decoupling and the things I've just talked about. So I will do a super crash course on what the Bayesian brain is. We'll see how this goes. And we're going to be talking about primarily from the view of Carl's free energy principle, which is a very particular kind of normative approach to the Bayesian brain. And ultimately I'm going to try to convince you that this is a much better way to represent that complex spaghetti graph you saw as a Markov blanket. So at the heart of predictive coding is the idea that we have functional segregation for prediction errors versus predictions. So what that means is we have particular cell types which are specifically associated with either encoding in a Bayesian sense the expected cause of sensory input or the mismatch between the expected cause and the actual sensory input that's gotten. And these are actually mapped specifically neurobiologically onto the deep or superficial layers of the cortex, with the superficial layers carrying the forward prediction error and the deep areas carrying the backwards, if I didn't mix that up. Where importantly, at each level, you have this kind of self-inhibitory connections which are encoding the precision associated with both of those signals. So what is precision? This is something that comes right out of the basic laws of Bayes' theorem. So Bayes' theorem tells us essentially how do we combine some prior knowledge with some sensory information or data to arrive at a posterior belief. And it tells us that we do that by multiplying some prior beliefs. So my belief that the average height of people in the Netherlands is 61 centimeters or something, with some data, the likelihood that I actually go out and say I measure 100 students and see what their heights are, and then I arrive at my posterior belief, which is sort of an updated prior. And since I'm multiplying these two together, the result of that will always be precision weighted. That means, let's say I go out and I go to a school which is really not representative, and I measure some people who are just really noisy. Half of them are incredibly tall, and half of them are incredibly short. Then I'm going to have more uncertainty in my actual, oh sorry, that should have been on the likelihood. So a better way to put it would be, let's say I'm really not sure about how tall people in the Netherlands are. So I put a wider uncertainty on that prior belief, or vice versa, I go out and collect data, and my instrument is noisy, so I have a higher uncertainty in the actual data I collect. Whichever one is noisier, essentially, will be where I end up, which is very intuitive as a scientist, because all this means is that if I collect bad data, I'm not going to update my beliefs very much, and if I have really strong beliefs, maybe dangerously, I won't update them unless I have really good data. And this is important because when we try to understand the brain, we're trying to move away from a boxological approach towards writing down the generative principles that explain why the brain is this way and not any other way. So what that means is we try to find a set of very basic principles based on information theory and physics that explain the entire functioning of the brain, and actually more generally the functioning of any biological organism. And to do this, what makes this really distinct from something like classical predictive coding is we get away from the notion of needing some kind of arbitrary cost function. So cost function is just when I make my decision, let's say I have, I don't know if I can actually explain that well. So Bayes' theorem tells us how to combine priors with data to arrive at a posterior belief, but let's say we have multiple different priors, multiple different hypotheses we're testing. And we have some evidence for each of those different hypotheses, and now we have to decide which one is best. For that we need something based in Bayesian decision theory, which is going to be evaluating the fit of each model to the data we get against the complexity of that model. And classical predictive coding theory would do this by ascribing, so for example, something like reinforcement learning would ascribe to a kind of arbitrary value function. So you might say, outcomes are the least valuable, I always get this wrong. The point is that they're circular. So we try to get away from this by instead appealing to the notion of some sort of organismic integrity, where essentially what the agent has to do to survive is to accurately predict its own environment. Because if it's not predicting its own environment accurately, then it's increasing the entropy over its internal states. And if the entropy over internal states is unbounded, the organism dies. It suffers peak death, essentially. And what makes this a really cool approach is, rather than having the computations be strictly within the kind of system of the brain, here action and the environment play a critical causal element, because there are two directions of fit that I can manipulate my model, or I can update my model. So I can either change my prior beliefs when they don't fit the world, so I can update my prior, or I can actually do what's called active inference, and I can just directly act on the world to make it resemble my prior beliefs more. Or to put it another way, I can sample the world in a different way. I can perform the experiment in a different way so that it better conforms to my prior belief. And when you put this all together, you get some really nice solutions to classical problems. So things like attention and salience and learning, they all fall naturally out of this view, where you have sort of feed-forward predictions, which are encoding, say, the external cause of some sensory input, say a vertically oriented line or a horizontally oriented line. Feedback predictions, which are based on learning, so they're based on my accumulated experience over the lifetime to refine those priors and to accurately infer causes. And then I think most uniquely, this idea of postsynaptic gain, which is encoding that actual precision we talked about, right? So this is the thing which is going to enable me to respond in different ways to the same input. This is the thing that's going to enable me to have a very context-sensitive processing stream. So, let's say normally I have some neuron which responds positively to getting more money than I expect, except in cases where that's a bad thing because now maybe the IRS is coming for me. That precision modulation means that my neuromodulatory system can recognize that very specific circumstance and say, oh, we have a really precise prior belief that you don't actually want this to be the case. And now when the extra money comes in, I'm not very happy about it. It's kind of a silly example I just made up, but the point is that we believe that the neuromodulatory system of the brain, which I think maps really nicely onto Daniel's kind of domain general in the middle, that layer in the middle I've been talking about, which is how do you actually integrate between these deep, complex, slow, temporally integrated deep beliefs and these very fast little predictive codes about what the actual content or the external causes are. And our answer for that is by having this very rich, centralized network which can essentially let your prior beliefs about value and desire and all these types of things directly modulate your action and sensations. And the idea is that this lets us get from this. So I looked at this again and again because the idea should be that ultimately the sum of the whole brain's activity is what you could call a Markov blanket, which I'm not very good at explaining it, but the idea of a Markov blanket is that, I want to skip ahead to this slide. So this is from Carl's paper on life as we know it. So the idea is that any agent which wants to survive will have to make accurate predictions of its environment. And to do that, it will have to appear as if it's having internal states. So what that means is, to make the external environment orderly, it has to create orderly internal states. And then it uses those orderly internal states to predict the external environment. And this kind of autopoietic feedback between the maintaining of integrity and the ability to act on and predict the environment is actually what delineates the organism itself. So it's like the cell wall, if you will, that allows us to maintain our homeostasis in the face of a constantly changing entropic world. And I think, in some sense, what I actually want to say is that things like mind wandering and consciousness and essentially this meta network we call the default mode, they're a kind of active inference in which the brain is actively rearranging itself. It's actively, through a cascading kind of global prediction, constraining all the lower level activity or literally shaping it through precision modulation so that you can be very dynamic and so that you can sort of be many different people at once, if you will. This is kind of what this model looks like. So this is something I've been working on with Carl in the context of conscious awareness, but I think we can kind of borrow it. And this is just trying to reduce from this guy down to something a little more tenable, which is the idea that out here you've got basically binary predictive coding, which is trying to decode what's out there in the world. In here, in the kind of rich cloak default mode, you've got the deep belief network, which is really just when I say deep belief network, I mean, if you know anything about kind of these deep hierarchical learning networks, it's like as you get deeper in the network, you essentially get farther and farther away from the actual sensory input, where the stuff that's encoded here is totally abstract, right? So this is an example from Deep Dream, which is one of these reinforcement learning Bayesian networks. And this is a network which has learned a lot about dogs. And essentially, anytime you feed it any kind of image, it hallucinates from low-level features that there are sort of meta-level dogs in this image. So it kind of perceives dogs where there are none on the basis of its expectations. And the idea is that deep in this network, you go 3 layers in, is encoded a totally abstract representation of a dog, which just says any combination of low-level features that looks a certain way must be a dog. Now, obviously, this would be sort of like a schizophrenic perception where you have maybe an overly precise belief that anything that looks this isn't. So I had to really work hard to get this because there's a lot of not safe for work images of these now. So someone's taken a lot of pornographic images and run them through Deep Dream. So be careful if you make a talk. I think it's just a doge. It's a doge with a lot of little dogs. I hope. Anyway, I don't know where I'm at now. So to wrap up, how does this all fit into mind wandering?
Oh, you got an answer?
I do.
Oh, great.
Good. So, what I propose is that the brain has a kind of fundamental model fitting problem when it has to try to optimize over both long-term and short-term scales. So, there's something in modeling known as the mountain car problem. And Carl and my colleague Francesco Rigoli, in the context of value-based decisions, have recently tried to use this to solve the problem of kind of exploitation versus exploration. So a common criticism of the Bayesian brain hypothesis is, if I have a Bayesian brain which wants to minimize my prediction error, why don't I just go sit in a dark room and do nothing all day and just, that would really minimize my surprise. Why do I ever seek out novelty? And the answer is that there are kind of 2 kinds of value for an organism, if you will. So there's something which is kind of, I should say, this emerges when you stop to consider the brain as just a single snapshot, but when you actually start to think about how do I minimize my prediction error maximally over a long time scale. And this relates to the mountain car problem, because the mountain car problem is basically just, so in any kind of machine learning, let's say I'm trying to optimize some model fit. I'm trying to find the best model for the data while minimizing the complexity of the model. And let's say I'm going down, I'm adding parameters, I'm tweaking them, I'm getting better and better. Seems like, wow, this is really great. Actually, this is a terrible example because this is the global minima. So the one I hand drew was better, because what we should imagine is something that goes like this, right? So imagine an energy landscape that goes like this, and we're like, yeah, this is great, we're so low here. And then it starts to go up, or goes down. So if we're in our little mountain trolley car, we're going down, we're saying, this is a great model, this is an even better model. And then we get here and say, no, this isn't good anymore, we've gone wrong. So we settle down here into this local minima, and then we're stuck. We say, this is great, I've found the answer, this is the best model I could possibly have. But in fact, if we could have taken on a little bit of noise in our model, if we could have taken on a little bit of error, we could have gotten over this hump and found a really much better place to be. And the idea is that this is actually how we solve, this is actually how we solve important problems where I have to choose between an option which has a kind of immediate value in terms of the apple, right? So in the reward domain, you can imagine that the apple's something I want, there's no uncertainty, I get it, I get some sugar, I eat it, that's great. Versus the refrigerator, where I don't know what the refrigerator contains in this kind of vignette, right? The refrigerator can have a badger in it, and I don't want a badger, I want an apple. But the refrigerator might also have a turkey in it, big, nice Thanksgiving turkey. So the brain has to kind of constantly optimize the value of an action which is very short term, right? So the value of grabbing the apple, going for the immediate information, versus the epistemic value of the fact that I might gain new knowledge about the world that I didn't have before if I do the unexpected thing. If I incur a short-term increase in my prediction error. And I think that this is exactly what mind wandering in the default mode is helping us to do. Because here the problem, this is in a very specific domain. How do I choose the best reward? How do I optimize when exploiting a current environment? If I'm a rat, do I exploit the cheese, or do I forage for a better cheese source? But I think more generally, if you go back to that perception problem, why does the brain attenuate its sensory information? Well, we can actually find a case where this is already happening. So there's the classic case of sensory attenuation in motor action. So the classic you can't tickle yourself kind of idea. So one of the really well-established findings in neuroscience is that you have this sort of efference copy sensory attenuation. So when I go to make a motion, or if I go to tickle myself, I can't do it. The information is automatically attenuated. And there's a general idea which has been proposed by my colleague Harriet Brown, that basically if the brain uses this kind of active inference precision weighting scheme, the only way it can initiate a motor action is to actually attenuate the information from the sensory system, because when you make a motor action under this scheme, what you're basically doing is you're making a prediction, right? So you're saying, kind of doing like a model fitting problem in your head, where you go, okay, I need to reach left or reach right, and there's all these counterfactual directions you don't reach, you know, in your pre-SMA or whatever, and you would never be able to get off the ground with the action if you weren't in that moment attenuating sensory information, right? Because each one of those sort of little predictions would cause a prediction error which you would then have to solve. So it's a bit convoluted, but the basic idea is there's a very simple principle which explains exactly why we have to sensory attenuate. And when we need to sensory attenuate is precisely when we needed to choose between an option which is competing at the same level, or I don't know if that's how I want to say it. So I think what I'm trying to say is that if to do deep learning, we need to be able to entertain lots of possible outcomes, right? So if I need to be able to project myself into the future and think about, you know, which job should I take? I don't know, you know, this one gives better benefits, but this one is more related to my quality of life and blah, blah, blah. If these are things that are being inverted by our big, high-level central model, right, to do those and not be overwhelmed by the sort of sensory prediction errors that they would immediately cause. Because when I make that sort of prospection into the future, you know, I'm not actually in that future. So if the brain was running in its normal online mode, it would get instantly overwhelmed, and you would never be able to actually decouple and do this totally deep level of learning, because you'd simply always be trying to solve the immediate sensory environment. So that's the kind of idea, is that we have this sort of layer sandwich network, and because we have a lot of sort of metabolic surplus in our life, where, you know, oh, the honeybee analogy, that brings it all together. Right, this is the first time I've ever put these stuff together. Where's the honeybee? Okay. There's no honeybee? Okay, I'll tell you the honeybee analogy. Oh, there it is. So, I think this will be the last slide I do. Yeah. So, at the end of the day, it's kind of an evolutionary story, right? So, imagine the honeybee. So the honeybee goes out into the world, and, you know, it knows because of the bee dance or whatever, it knows exactly where the flower is. So it goes right in the flower, and this is a good, safe strategy, right? The world's very dangerous, it's very uncertain, it wants to just do the beeline right to the honey and back. And while it's out there, it has to be really coupled on its perceptual information. The most valuable thing to explain is the current sensory information. Because if it's not attending and processing the sensory information, it could get eaten by a bird, or it could do something really bad, it could miss the flower and die out there, so it's got to be totally on the mode. But it's got all these eyes that are collecting all this data, all this kind of data that's hitting on the not task relevant channels. And that's going somewhere, right? I mean, the brain is not a sieve, it kind of stores everything somehow. So when the bee gets back to its place, now it's got all the honey, it's done the dance, everybody else knows where it is. Now it's got a nice metabolic surplus, it can afford to just relax and do nothing. And when it does this, there would be an immediate epistemic value to start to data mine stored memories, right? Because maybe while the bee was out there was another bush with twice as many flowers on it, and it couldn't, you know, it didn't really notice it in the time because it was focused in on this kind of mode. But as soon as it got back, it starts to do this, you know, it goes offline, doesn't care about current sensory information, cares about all that rich information that's stored, and is trying to now predict from the self model, what's the best way to optimize my goals, what's the best way to get the best honey. And it goes, there was another flower I never even thought about, and it goes and does the bee dance, and the hive is really happy. So the idea is that by having a brain which can both optimize the short-term problem of what's the best model for the sensory information right now, but can also say, I don't care all about the sensory information right now, what I care about is very abstract things that have nothing to do with this, you can have basically the best of both worlds. I don't know if that made sense, but here we go. The future. Sorry, I expected it would get bad by the end. this is just to show that the stuff I was talking about, it actually is a model. So there you could actually do a computational model of mind wandering. Someone's actually already published a paper on computational modeling of mind wandering. I tried to write down how we would actually do that, and I should just go to the methods meeting and have Carl tell me basically.
It's not that sort of computational model though. The new one is different. It's about what it does as opposed to where it happens or what it's
Yeah, because the example he gives is that, so this little rat maze example is where the T maze is like the rat can either go here and it can sniff a cue, which will give it information, or it can go to the left or right and it might get the cheese, the red of the cheese. And it's like, why would the rat ever sniff the cue and not just take the thing that has a surefire utility? And then they can model all this, and there's a simple toolbox to do it all. But what we want is something, what you want, I think, to model this problem is something where you can vary the information that's in the current environment. Like where you have a little simple agent who has to make a sensory decision over and over again. Do I want left or right? But where it can also build up some kind of stored memory representation, like of all the past choices, I guess. And then the prediction would be that when the agent has exhausted the value of the immediate sensory information, then it would be more likely to mind wander. And we could sort of fit that model and then actually fit it to real mind wandering data and try to show that this is why people do this.
It must be what's explaining my goal experiment. The goal experiment.
Yeah. Well, I had a thing about stuff that we predict. Right? So one thing you predict is that exactly that people who do more future thinking.
Right. And they use the PSMA. So one thing, it's interesting because we've been wondering about the PSMA a lot, right? And I'm wondering about, so your explanation for our idea of the PSMA was something like this. Imagine, as an analogous to Chris's book, we talked about picking up the wine glass. That's the afference thing we got.
Right.
Okay, so, and the way I thought that that was, it would be unhelpful to get certain types of information whilst you're initiating the reach. And so then we were wondering about what the PSMA, because it comes up in semantic control experiments too. We have that coupling thing I showed. And we wonder whether what it does in that context, I think it's just maybe the state that your model would predict, which is that if I am about to initiate a mind wandering episode, so there would be kind of like a collapse into a particular line of thought that's about to happen. And that's exactly the same problem as reaching for the wine glass, because once that's about to take place, the last thing you want to do is to let any of the systems that are going to accumulate and produce different alternative mind wandering episodes to occur.
Right.
So you'd have to have this kind of system where it would be exactly analogous. I think it's an analogous problem to picking up the glass of wine. Because basically, once you're going to pick up that glass of wine, you really don't want to pick up anything else at the same time. That would screw it up. So once you're going to have this thought about this future, you certainly do not want to have any other thoughts happening at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and it's exactly the same type of model selection problem. Just one is in a concrete domain and one's in an abstract domain. So it's like this idea from Anil Seth about counterfactual predictions and stuff. I think it directly applies to this because it's exactly the mind wandering state is not this like totally chaotic random thing, right? It's very purposeful, and it's exactly like you say, to entertain one whatever his future self simulation or something like that, you'd have to attenuate all the other ones that you don't do, right? You'd have to have some kind of selection procedure to do that, and presumably that would be related to, I mean, it's probably related to a lot of things, like the salience of recent information or competition among goals and things.
But it's also just like, I think it's the same as exploitation exploration paradox, right? Because if you imagine, like, your mind is blind, there's stuff bubbling away, thought is going to happen next. But that is like exploration.
Yes,
There's
exactly.
a thought space, and you're going to find one part of it and it have to avoid it. But as soon as you find it, you have to stop letting all the other thought spaces have to be suppressed. In the same way that happens when you reach for the wine glass, for example. Because all the other motor actions you could make would have to.
It could almost be like a prediction. This is a bit weird way to put it. It could be like a prediction that a certain type of thought will have the best trade-off for my goal.
Right, exactly.
Right? It's like if I think about cheese wheels, I might become a better cheesemonger. I mean, I don't know why I get these crazy examples, but that's something you and I think we really tried to go hash that out. We haven't gathered it before.
But see, it also makes sense because like it's important for semantic tasks where there's like you're trying to there's like for weak associations where there are essentially lots of objects that could be kind of related, and one of them is maybe a little bit more than So that's some kind of problem, because the problem with semantic tests is you can always come up with a story. So for example, one of the semantic face people, they said peaches goes with dog, and when we asked them, they said, well, that's because my dog used to like peaches when I was a kid. You know, like, well, that's fine, you can't say that's wrong, it's just very weird, right?
It makes me think a little bit about like narrative and stuff. So sometimes I think about if there could be, like, if you were ultimately going to try to make a Bayesian theory of conscious thought, you would need, where is the thingy? I don't know what I'm looking for anymore. I forget, it doesn't matter. So, what was it? So, oh yeah, no, it's my model. So sometimes I think a lot about the idea that like the guiding force in our like autobiographical selves is the story we tell, right? So it's like I'm Micah, I like research, I like consciousness and things like this, I like Francesca. So and that you could almost think of as like a very complex tapestry of predictions. Like those are all things that interlock. Like each one tells you something else about myself, right? And the thing that is myself is this kind of model, it's like chain model of all the different predictions linked up. And then it's like, so mind wandering is like, should I add this extra chain or not type thing? Or which part of the chain should I be in? And then, you know, when you have some kind of self-violation, when you have some kind of thing that you just don't agree with on that level, like that's the level of prediction errors at. Like this doesn't fit my story. You know, like I'm not an architect. What are you talking about? You know? But I guess ultimately what you start to get into is kind of like a Bayesian theory of semantics, which I've been resisting every time we talk about it.
Well, that's a good thing.
I think it's a good idea. I think it would be. I just think it would be a nice first step to try to write down the version of the exploitation exploration thing, which would explain like very simple go no go behavior. But I don't know how to. Maybe Carl would have a nice idea of how to view it with memory, because it needs some kind of thing it can draw from, some internal thing that it can draw from, rather than just maybe if it like samples its own priors. I don't know. But that's what I think it does. Well, that's like the whole idea, right? Is like instead of sampling the world, you just start sampling your memory, basically, which is your bank of priors. So you start sampling all your stored knowledge. It's like you close the loop. So instead of, usually you would test your hypothesis by gathering sensory data, and instead you test your hypothesis by gathering stuff from memory, something like that. I think Will Penny is actually working on something in the context of forward and backward sweeps in memory, which is, so actually that image I showed a million times, this one, no it's not, it's the old image that's not there anymore. Doesn't matter. I know Will Penny's working on something on these networks with forward and backward sweeps. So, because you mentioned the forward sweep thing. Yeah. The place cell. Anyway. Sorry. I hope this was useful.
So, really interesting that you ended on the bumblebee, because in a way, we started out with these bootcamps to discuss also what would be the implications of a topic for interactive minds. And if there is a species that seems to ride on interaction minds, it's really
Enter into interaction, we form this dynamic narrative, which is like essentially we become totally predictable to one another, and it's because there's this thing in between us that's bridging us, this kind of, you know, I can't remember, Christian would have a word for this thing, but it's like this, it's something that's more than the sum of the interactions that we use to become very predictable to one another. And I think like this generative model, not this one per se, but the idea I have about this self model, because what I didn't talk about is like in the context of consciousness, a lot of it I think is about not only predicting an expected sensory cause, but like the conjoint expectation of I expect some sensory cause and I expect some internal response to it, right? So I expect that you'll have an apple and I'll really want it type thing, like kind of extero, intero. But that model, if you invert it, becomes exactly the way you bridge with someone else, right? Because if I can predict my own internal reactions to some sensory cause, then I can predict your likely sensory reactions. And if we're doing that, like Chris says, simultaneously together, then we form some kind of prediction narrative, which is actually, as I understand it, it's like the interaction itself starts to predict both of our own brains better than we can predict the other type thing. So I think they could be very seamless, even with the kind of optimally interacting minds approach.